Just outside of a decade since arguably their biggest release ever, Skyrim, Bethesda's had a lot of changes to their studio and their overall philosophy in that time. From being acquired by Microsoft to Fallout 76 and Fallout 4 being disasters at launch for being too different from previous games, let alone all the bugs, many people had their eyes on the newest title from the studio both as a ray of light in the darkness and also another dark mark for the beloved studio. With a new IP announced many years ago and the promise of their take on a space sim, many fans eagerly awaited how expansive and deep a world like that from Bethesda could be. Many people had also been burned by the promises of other companies in this space too, no pun intended. From No Man's Sky's abysmal launch and Rebirth to the ever-waiting promises of Star Citizen, fans of the genre were cautious at best for a game to launch and launch well, and Bethesda accepted that challenge, boldly going where many of their previous titles had not gone before. A successful launch. With their own take on space life and life in space, Bethesda and Todd Howard managed to not make complete memes of themselves. That mountain, you can climb it, and planet, you can explore it. It just works. Most of the time. Did Bethesda actually create a game we all hoped for, a Skyrim in space, or did they blindfold us into another cold launch that we'll have to wait for modders to fix? Let's blast off to new horizons in Starfield's Loop. The gameplay of Starfield is pretty much exactly what you would expect it to be compared to other Bethesda titles. Enemies to handle, conversations to have, outposts to build, and overall exploration of this massive universe to accomplish. Bethesda stuck to their guns in many ways with this title, and for better or worse, it's a Bethesda game through and through. The first-person ground combat of Starfield feels very similar to Skyrim or Fallout. Ranged weapons and melee weapons both make an appearance and serve different purposes and playstyles while feeling mostly tight and technical. Every once in a while, the combat feels a bit loose, with unexpected twists and turns with some weapons and enemies. Things looking like they should have interacted a certain way and just not, and sneaking not always working the way you want it to, but there are so many factors in building a character in these games that it may just be user error a lot of times. Then, there's the addition of temple powers, a feature of the main game starting a bit deep in the main questline. These powers feel very similar to the Dragonborn powers of Skyrim or the magic system of that game at times. Different abilities that allow you to do a host of different things throughout your time in the black. Zero gravity adds a new level to combat in Starfield that took some getting used to in my time. Really, both Zero G and Low G were fun to play around with and learn how different things would react with different gravity. One such scene in particular is on a space station that you can happen upon. The gravity of the station is off, and the combat you have there can get a little shaky, but it's a fun twist on the time spent shooting at space pirates on the ground in any other climate. Space combat in Starfield actually feels pretty good too. Not nearly as technical as other games in the genre like Star Citizen or Elite Dangerous, the combat is simple but feels really good. Maybe the closest example I have is something like Star Wars Squadron, where it was the main focus of the game, but wasn't meant to be overly realistic or technically gatekept to pilots and flight sim enthusiasts. Flight in general is way simpler than those games, and I think that's a good thing for a title as ambitious as Starfield. While plenty of people want that sort of thing, there are games for it that are more hard science or simulation-like available for that. This game is still an RPG, but an important part of a space RPG is flight and combat, and Bethesda does that well here. Still integrating things like power management and control, but without the deep detail like controlling your landing gear and shield directions. Outposts in Starfield feel like a completely different game wrapped into the overall dynamic of a Bethesda title. What feels like taking inspiration from games like Satisfactory and other survival crafters. Outposts are built on planets with crafting, developing, and automation all taking the forefront of the content. The goal and objective here is to continue to develop bigger and better automation to make production of parts and materials better, to then get more parts and materials, to make even bigger and better things, and so on. I understand why this would be an important part of the game, but having played through the entire base game without doing much at all for this content, it felt unneeded and like a time sink for a very specific type of player. Don't get me wrong, I spent hundreds of hours in Satisfactory and many other survival crafters, but the hamster wheel of this type of gameplay does not speak to me in a title like Starfield with so much story and universe to explore. Spending an ungodly amount of time on a planet to make a base just felt like a waste. Not to mention, many of the planets that are best to outpost on are literal wastes. Vast lands of materials and not a whole lot else unless you have companions there to talk to. But even then, the conversations in Starfield leave a lot to be desired. Almost half of your time not shooting at something or running around is spent talking with characters, intentionally or not. Character interactions are a cornerstone of Bethesda titles and feel the exact same they have for many other titles, both for the betterment and detriment of the game as a whole. I really don't like when games are too similar to other titles from a dev or a publisher. In some cases, it feels lazy. I guess to some it makes it a safer buy in the struggle of finding time in this day and age, but still the lack of innovation from many of these companies is draining. Utilizing the same system of communication with minimal updates for the past 20 odd years feels a bit boring in all honesty, especially with games like Baldur's Gate and Cyberpunk feeling like the next evolution of this system in different ways. You still talk to characters the exact same way. Their expressions and facials don't really change all that much depending on how they're reacting. They are dead center on your screen the whole time, and there's no real interaction with the game besides choosing your next dialogue option. You can't move, you can't change your angle, nothing. And it's been like this since at least Morrowind. Any update to not stare at blank faces when having a conversation would be a huge update. In my opinion, even Mass Effect and Dragon Age do it better, and they're plagued with BioWare face complaints that have been a known pressure point for gamers for years. Exploring the black vastness of a universe can be incredibly exhilarating, or daunting, depending on your outlook at life, and Starfield is no exception for this. With tons of planetary systems to work through and hundreds of planets and moons to explore on foot, the glutton of choice hits hard in this game. Except for a few certain death situations, namely gas giants and stars, you can pretty much land wherever you like and take a look around a rocky surface. But getting to those planets and moons takes some thought and effort when jumping from place to place in your ship. Starting from the top, there are all different types of star systems to travel to in your personal ship, and there are infinite types of ships and builds to choose from. The building of a ship can be taken from a lot of different approaches: buying a pre-made ship from a vendor, stealing one on a planet, or by other means in space, getting a ship as a reward for a quest line. All of these lead to bigger and better ships that allow both easier traversal and more dynamic and better combat in space. There is one key to getting around all the planets though, and that is the universe's version of light speed, warp speed, Mass Effect relay, you know the drill. The grav jump. Grav jumping takes special parts, and it's the magic sauce that lets the player get around such a big universe at the blink of an eye. Your initial ship can jump pretty effectively, but you'll need better ships or at least upgraded parts in order to jump around and handle the distance as you progress in the game. The game even stops at least once until you have a high enough quality ship to handle more massive jumps. Just like any other form of FTL travel in games and media, you pretty much just drop into wherever you're going and deal with the ramifications when you get there. These ships make the game feel more advanced in their jumping between worlds, but it does get a bit stale when you're taken out of it just to realize it's just fast travel and load screens, like anything else. Which isn't a bad thing in this genre, but with how many load screens you hit everywhere in this game, it makes it feel less open and more disjointed than I believe many were hoping for. Grav jumping is only one form of special traversal though, and your ship's engines and overall upgrades can help you with the other. You can just blast off into the black and search for planets in a system. As shown in many forms of media and social media at this point, you can fly off from Earth and end up at Pluto, given that you wait around long enough to do so. Traversing a system is just flat out easier with grav jump. But for all the real badasses out there, or people that want their sci-fi to be more grounded in reality, there are options for you as well. The black isn't the only place to explore and traverse though. In fact, all those planets floating out there are made just for this task. With hundreds of them to choose from, and all of them having different options and things to look for, it would be insane to just spend all of your time in your ship and not on foot exploring the vastness of human civilization. There's a lot of story to catch up on in all the years between current human time and the game's far future. Lots of things have happened throughout society and historically that are all parts of this game's lore and story that feel archaeological at many points. Many different things can be found on the planets, from caves filled with life to old human settlements and even robotics working completely autonomously. Many parts of the game feel fleshed out, but only parts, as much of the ground on these celestial bodies offer little but dirt and places for outposts to mine up resources. Much of the universe is filled with planets that kind of feel samey across the board. I guess that's kind of reality, but not much feels truly different or alien. It's rock worlds, big bugs, things that look like dinosaurs, and not a whole lot else. One could almost make the conclusion that life is kind of the same everywhere, or that in this time period, just like during the colonialism on Earth, humans brought species with them that just adapted and survived on these new worlds. You can run into many of the same species on many planets, and it never really felt diverse to me. Just, oh, these bugs live here too? The most alien things on many of the planets were some of the people and how they interacted. The characters you meet, interact with, and even play as have way more story than any of the planets or moons that you end up on, and that's kind of the saving grace of Starfield. While traveling on ships into bodies unknown is exciting for the first go-around, it's the characters that give life to the universe presented here. From the first moments as the player starts the game, we see interaction and story start to appear. Why are we mining? How does this work affect the verse? Can we roleplay like this forever? The answer to the last one is a bit yes and no. The mining can be fun, and you can definitely RP as a worker for the rest of your playthrough if you try hard enough, but the minutia didn't feel like it was lost quickly. It felt like you could do whatever and be whatever while plotting around the universe to save the day. The characters you meet along the way, though, can even help that in some ways. With diverse backgrounds and their own moral codes, Bethesda has once again built out characters that grow and change around you. Yes, they still have that Bethesda stiffness, but some of the actual stories around you help to make these characters actually come alive and breathe the same air as the player. Unless you're talking to Vasco. I don't think he breathes. Starting off with your new space buds and Constellation, characters here all have a goal in mind for what the universe's secrets mean and what to do with them. From the explorer types like Sarah and Barrett to the deeper meaning big thinkers like Noel and Mateo, these characters help to make sure that whatever path you decide to go down has a goal in mind and a plan behind it. There are a lot of tropes that these characters take upon themselves and nods to different space media across the board. From Sam Coe as the Firefly-esque space cowboy, and how the entirety of the Freestar Collective gives those same vibes, to Barrett being a witty space rogue in the vein of Han Solo. Even Sarah is arguably running away from her military past and gets involved in this grand scheme of sci-fi progenitor race type story similar to The Expanse. You can see many nods and explanations, but they all fit well in this interpretation of space. The characters don't feel so cookie cutter that they are obvious stand-ins, but they do have the nods and strings that tie them to their roots in media. The factions of this game also feel very built into the meta of the space sci-fi story. The United Colonies being the stand-in for the not-so-evil, usually, empire that spans the system and keeps the peace and order on their worlds with military force when needed. The Freestar Collective being that new frontier, westernized space cowboy group where you're only as good as the iron you carry and the ship you rode in on. The major players of the worlds feel like their own archetypes with some interesting twists and turns built into their stories to steer just enough away from or sometimes straight into those archetypes. One of the most interesting factions that I came across and completed the story for is the Crimson Fleet. Playing their missions around this game felt like the pirate treasure hunt stories that I craved from games like the Uncharted series, but also had twists with the double agent spy thriller themes that got me involved with them in the first place, making me really rethink my character's morals as the story started and progressed further. The Starborn are their own special level of faction that can really be a help or a hindrance depending on how you look at them throughout your playtime. Their ideals and what they want really throwing the character into some moral questions that even the rest of the game doesn't touch. How they interact with you depends completely on how you interact with them, and it's not just that they're the big bad, but they're also not the all-seeing, higher power protagonist either. It gets a bit heavy and deep sci-fi with their story and desires, and that makes them a great standout while also being kind of secondary to other factions as you meet them. The characters and factions in this game give so much to the universe that the planet hopping discovery mechanic really lacked in my mind. It felt more like a chore hopping to different planets when the characters of the story were the real meat of the process, which almost feels counterintuitive to the idea of a space exploration RPG at different times. Along with all the characters in this game comes the story, and there's a lot to talk about here. Before we get too deep into the story, I want to talk about how I played the game and why. Early on, it was revealed, or spoiled for me, that there was a New Game Plus feature, and it seemed infinite. Without knowing anything about the story or really how New Game Plus worked in Starfield, I took that as a way for me to really break down the expansiveness of this game and work through different storylines at different times. This review is based on my first completion of the game and some brief bits in the New Game Plus, so the entire story will not be talked about here, with its hours of side missions and plot options. The other part of this playthrough was that I didn't want to save scum for better options. I wanted to play the game through as best as possible. After coming off Cyberpunk and Baldur's Gate, rushing to try everything and losing out on or missing different story elements, I became okay with the idea of next playthrough. And I want to keep that philosophy in mind, as what I get is what I get in this story, and it's my decisions that got me here. Now, the story as a whole leans a lot into other source material. The idea of the space map left by beings that can bend reality around them through alien tech or powers has been done. Mass Effect was an entire series grounded in that similar thing. The gameplay loop of finding new powers through dungeons to make you the ultimate power in the world has been done before. In fact, Skyrim is a good example of that. I can go on and on about the ideas and mechanics pulled from other games, but here's an example of a game that sticks them all in the same house and makes them coexist. And they do it pretty well, managing to tell their own story and have the differences where they matter in this story as opposed to many of the other gameplay loops. Now, did the game feel dated or like a rehash for using these mechanics? No. The story of the game felt polished, and like every part of the mechanics was there for a reason, except Outpost. I really don't get that one. From the first artifact you find to the last one, it's an experience that is subtly different each time, sometimes wildly so. The artifacts driving much of the narrative, and who created them? What are they? Why do they exist all being questions that only partially get answered throughout the story, leaving way for future endeavors in this universe, potentially through DLC. What these things are, how they are seen throughout the universe, why the Starborn are after them at all, and what it all means flows together to have a great, if semi-confusing at times, story. The almost Bioshock Infinite-like loop being used as a mechanic and not just a story beat really opens up the different possibilities throughout the game. Where you meet certain characters, whether or not you team up with certain characters, what those characters think about you. It all plays into what you experience in your time and gives you new goals to move forward to in the future or changes to make. The side stories of the game are where a lot of the real meat is held. In my playthrough, before I could even really decide what faction story I wanted to follow, I got dragged kicking and screaming into the Crimson Fleet campaign and all the things it entails. The first meetings and what they ask you to do just to join the fleet, going on the elaborate treasure hunt for Crix's legacy, a supposed treasure of credits that could change the fleet forever, the fact that you're a double agent on a mission and how you handle certain missions as a whole can really affect your mileage through this story. Really a fun side mission that could have been a main story in other games. It's incredible the writing and gameplay detail available to the player here in a side story. Some of the other side stories that you run into are character stories, and if the list of characters is any hint, there are a lot of options here for you, and what you learn and do with each of them brings its own narrative and growth to each of them. For my playthrough, I almost accidentally blasted through Sarah's story. From the beginning, I wasn't a fan of her actually. But as her story progressed and I started to understand her backstory, I realized that the character here was similar in many ways to some of my favorite sci-fi characters. Leaving the military after seeing terrible things, survivor's guilt, trying to come to terms with family issues of the past and friends that died before you can make amends. All of this made Sarah feel real to me and allowed that bond to grow in-game to the point where I realized I wasn't just gunning for a fun night out sex scene, but I ended up marrying her. Okay, it wasn't that serious. But I hit a point of no return and was flirting with her constantly, and here we are. But it was a great story right up until the end, and I was mad at myself the whole time afterwards. But like I said before, I refused to save scum to change the outcomes. I stuck with my choices all the way until New Game Plus. New Game Plus in Starfield changes the game infinitely and allows for even more infinite, if that's possible, replayability. Like I said earlier, I stuck with my guns and refused to save scum or change anything on my playthrough, all the way through the end. Letting friends die, deciding to betray my morals at times, spending way too much time in space battles dying over and over again. Getting to the end of the story, you make a choice to continue to do everything in your current playthrough or start New Game Plus. And that choice was easy for me. I had things I wanted to atone for, things I wanted to change and do over again, stories I didn't do or complete in the first run that I wanted to try in the next. I really thought that New Game Plus was going to be better for me, and for some things it was. You start out post-intro with a mission to report to the lodge for the first time, but things are different. You have a special suit and a ship that many players in the mid to late game will recognize, and you have some different dialogue options, allowing you to completely skip the main story and just play through the side missions and collect the artifacts and temples again. The story really can be skipped, and with that, there are many changes to how things can play out if you have the right dialogue options at the right times. Side missions you weren't able to complete before, while completely restarted, become available again, and your failures are completely wiped away, ready for you to fall into them all over again in new and exciting ways. The only things you keep are your powers and skill points and level. No guns, no ships, no money. While it can be a bit of a system shock to lose all of that, it really allows you to do things and change the paradigm in your favor. There are things you already know will happen. There are bits you have no idea about. And as the new games roll on, there's even new variants and gags that were never meant to be seen in the first run. Many people are comparing this to a roguelike genre. Infinite runs all teaching you how to play better, and different things affecting your run and being completely changed. The only problem here is, I'm not a fan of the infinite loop gameplay style. I respect what Bethesda did here, and as an opportunity to dive into the story again and do things differently, I was excited and still am. The thought of running into the same rocks over and over to do the same artifacts in caves or temples seemed agonizing to me quickly after I started New Game Plus, so I stopped. I will come back. There's too much story left unseen for me not to, but with all the games on the horizon, the thought of making this my soul for the next forever doesn't intrigue me. Now I know there are many people who put hundreds, if not thousands of hours into Bethesda titles and the replayability. That is not me, and maybe by that stance, Bethesda titles aren't for me. But I have fun with a good story, and Bethesda has done that more than once for me. Continuing that trend, I stay excited for their next games. Besides the idea of sinking hundreds of hours into a game I just played, there are other reasons that this isn't a glowing recommendation for me. Plenty of the classic Bethesda game bugs abound. Glitching textures, companions that won't look at you during conversations, errors preventing certain events to trigger correctly, and general performance bugs as far as the eye can see. All told though, many of them didn't stop my gameplay for all that long. I'm sad to say I kind of expect this from Bethesda titles. Trying to make the games this big will lead to code that hitches, and it's almost like a rite of passage to see your first Bethesda title break itself at this point. I experienced a handful of crashes early on in my playthrough, and at least 1 or 2 in later stages as well. These issues, though, didn't hit me as hard as my biggest issue with the game: the planets and their diversity. As I said earlier in this review, the diversity between planets is lacking at best and barren at worst. I'm not naive enough to believe that every planet should be a lush oasis not touched by human hands. But for the same 4 enemy models to be called different things on different planets, on opposite sides of the universe, was more than a little disappointing. On top of the planets with their infinite space and ability to generate around the player with different areas and geography is cool and all, but when that geography is a different color of rock on pretty much every planet you land on, the game loses its luster for adventuring outside the bounds of the story pretty quickly. The random events you can run into on these different colored rocks can be fun, and there are some cool things to find, but nothing of note really happens. They just gave you a bunch of room for outposts, which is cool if they really mattered at all for this game. There are a lot of things to like here, and obviously if I didn't enjoy my time in this game, I wouldn't have finished it. However, I have a plea for all of the game developers out there. Tighten up your scope. Really thinking about the story played here and in New Game Plus and the different options that arise throughout. Much of the game takes place on nondescript rocks in space that look, act, and have the same life as 75% of the other rocks in the universe. There is no grand changes really. Some rocks are cold, some rocks are toxic, some have bugs, some have space lizards, but that's pretty much it. I may be a glutton for space, and may be asking too much, but looking at the diversity and properties like Destiny and its planets and enemies and life, or Red Rising and its terraforming and world structuring and societal pyramid, or even The Expanse and its super hard sci-fi exploration and possibilities on other systems without terraforming. These stories have so much more diversity in their worlds, and most of them never leave the Sol system. Why have all these planets and all this time spent for things, places, and story beats that have no meaning? The procedural generation of time wasting has been proven to be counterintuitive to the games that go down that road. There's more biodiversity in Spore, a game from 2008, than there is in a procedurally generated universe with hundreds of planets. There's more biodiversity and geological diversity on Earth alone than is represented in most of the planets and systems in this game, and games like it. As a Bethesda RPG, the game is good and tells a great story, but everything outside of the story feels hollow like its predecessors before it. While the Bethesda polish makes the time spent in this game with infinite replayability feel good, many stories to discover and places to explore, going to the same dusty rocks over and over again, ignoring everything around you because it doesn't matter, leaves the actual loop of this game feeling just as barren and hollow at times as the planets and moons that you land on repeatedly. And don't even get me started about there not being any Chicago landmarks on Earth.